Hello everyone, I'm Daniel Steele and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people here at UBC campus. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about paternalism and proportionality, and this will cover the anchor reading from week 9 of the syllabus. And this reading, as we'll see, is focused on plain packaging in tobacco. So the main thing I'm going to focus on in this reading is explaining the different concepts that come up in this paper, because there's quite a few of them, and it can be a bit much to sort of keep your head around all of these things and keep them all in your mind clearly. So there were 3 types of paternalism, which each had sort of two subtypes, and then there were 3 types of proportionality, and that's a lot to keep track of. So I'll go through all of those, and I won't dive into Anchor's arguments in great depth in this video. We'll cover that in class, but I will point out from time to time where the concepts that we're discussing connect to some of the issues raised in the reading. Okay, so let's start with paternalism. Paternalism is the idea of restricting someone's freedom for their own good. And so for that, obviously, you've got to have some kind of restriction of freedom, and you've got to have that the reason you're restricting that person's freedom is for their benefit, not, for example, to prevent harm to other people, but for their own good. In the readings, in the anchor reading, there are 3 different types of paternalism that are distinguished. These are soft versus hard paternalism, weak versus strong paternalism, and pure versus impure paternalism. And the nice thing is that cartoons can help us understand the differences between these different types of paternalism. So let's start with soft versus hard paternalism. A classic example to illustrate this difference is about a person who is going to cross a bridge. You're in the picture in the middle, and the person doesn't realize this bridge is very feeble and in danger of collapsing at any moment. And so here's this person coming along, going to cross the bridge, and the person stops them and warns them and says, "Don't cross, it's about to collapse." So in this case, this is soft paternalism. Well, first of all, the person is restricting the freedom of this other person. He's stopping them from crossing the bridge. But it's soft because the person is about to take a risk involuntarily. The person doesn't know that the bridge is about to collapse, and therefore, although they're taking this action that's risky, they're doing so in a way that's not voluntary. And in this case, what makes the action not voluntary is that the person doesn't know that the risk is present. They don't know how dangerous the bridge is. An action could also be involuntary or non-voluntary because the person isn't in a state where they can rationally make a decision. Maybe their cognitive abilities are impaired, like if they've had too much to drink, or maybe if they're a child and they're too young to make a decision. In such a case, the person's behavior might not be voluntary because they're just not they don't have the ability to rationally assess the risks and their options and goals. So soft paternalism is for cases like that. The person either doesn't have crucial information about the risk, or they're not able to cognitively assess and rationally assess that risk. Hard paternalism, on the other hand, is a case where the person knows what the risk is. They're not cognitively impaired. They're able to understand the risk and assess it and weigh that in their value system, but they still want to do it. And you say, well, too bad, you can't cross anyway. It's this bridge is off limits. No one's allowed to cross it. That would be hard paternalism. So if we think about how is that relevant to plain packaging. Well, one question you might want to wonder about is, well, do people know about the risks of smoking? And here Anchor basically suggests that, well, everybody nowadays knows that smoking causes cancer. That's an interesting question. Does everyone, do people in general understand the risks of smoking? We had a reading earlier in the term where Racy argued that, in fact, many people don't really appreciate the risks. They don't appreciate things like how bad it would be to get cancer or how early in life you might get it as a result of smoking, and that they don't really understand the risks of smoking. You also might argue that an image like this, like of the Marlboro Man, that this image suggests implicitly that smoking can be healthy, right? Here's this tough, healthy-looking guy who smokes. Well, maybe I'm going to be like that too, and I don't have to worry about getting cancer from smoking. And so you could argue that there is definitely an element of informing people, and that people don't really fully understand the risks of smoking. However, you could also argue that there's a sense in which this is maybe a more of a hard paternalism kind of situation, because some people just want to have the package. If some people who understand the risk, and maybe they're old enough to make a rational decision, for those people, not allowing them to express their identity through tobacco packaging might be a restriction on their freedom. And this is an idea that Anker discusses. So moving on then to weak versus strong paternalism. Now this one is a bit tricky sometimes to distinguish from soft versus hard, but I'll try to make sure we can understand the difference. So with weak paternalism, the key issue is whether a person is sort of acting in accordance with their sort of real, authentic values, and whether the person who's restricting their freedom sort of supports those values or not. So in the first case over here on the weak paternalism side, the person really wants to stick to their diet. And the person who's going to restrict their freedom supports that goal. They want to help them stick to their diet. They support that goal and think that's a good thing. Yeah, you really should, try to cut back on eating the sweets and, stick to your diet. But this person who wants to stick to their diet is susceptible to temptation. If they see the cookies, they might just binge on those cookies and not be able to stop themselves. And so in order to help them stick to their diet, to accomplish the things that they want, this person, the paternalistic agent over here, hides the cookies in the closet, stashes them away, and in that way is restricting the person's freedom, but in order to help them achieve the thing that they actually want, in this case, to stick to their diet. Over here in strong paternalism, we've got the cookie monster, and the cookie monster doesn't care about diets. He doesn't care about his weight. He doesn't care about diabetes. He just cares about cookies. He just wants to eat cookies, and that's his true, most authentic desire, is to eat cookies. Oh, sorry. And in this case, strong paternalism basically says, well, that thing you want, that thing you really like, the thing you value most of all is just a bad thing, and you just shouldn't want it, and we're not going to let you have it. And so that's different than over here, where we support what the person wants, but we're going to restrict their freedom to help them achieve it. Now, you might ask, what's the difference between weak versus strong paternalism and soft versus hard paternalism? Notice that in soft paternalism and hard paternalism, the concern is the person acting voluntarily? Are they informed? Are they able to make a rational decision? Here, really, with weak paternalism, the concern is, what is the person's true underlying value? What is the thing that they really want? And that's the focus. It's not, are they informed or rational? Oh, and that's sort of the same thing over here. So in the case of hard paternalism, the person might be informed, the person might be rational, but then you're not really asking, well, is that really what they want? Is that really their true heart's desire? That's sort of not in that picture. So that's the key difference here, that weak paternalism is sort of asking about what is the person's sort of true authentic preference? What is it they really want? Okay. Now, if you think about an example of how this can be relevant to public health and to smoking in particular, you can think about the practice that is common now in grocery stores and other places that would sell cigarettes, of putting the cigarettes behind a box, behind a, like this, behind a kind of cabinet where you can't see them, and they're sort of hidden, and you have to sort of go and ask, and then someone goes and unlocks the cabinet and gets you your cigarettes. Notice this makes the cigarettes much less sort of appealing, and it's very similar to the hiding the cookies in the closet. And that means that for someone, say, who's trying to quit smoking, this will make it easier for them to stick to that plan of quitting smoking. And so that could be like weak paternalism, in just the same way as hiding the cookies in the closet would be. So finally, let's look at pure versus impure paternalism. In pure versus impure paternalism, this is one that's kind of challenging to understand at first when you read the definition, but hopefully these cartoons will help you understand it. So Pure paternalism means that the people who are restricted are the same as the people who benefit. So here's a simple example. Imagine this guy right here wants to jump from the CN Tower. He wants to bungee jump from the CN Tower because he thinks that will be a really exciting, fun thing to do. And a security guard sees him going up there and says, no, you can't do that. You can't bungee jump from there. So the security guard is restricting this guy's freedom for his own good because he could very easily kill himself by bungee jumping from this tower. And the person who's being restricted, namely this would-be bungee jumper, is also the one who's benefiting. He's less likely to die thanks to the security guard not allowing him to jump. So in this case, the person being restricted is the same as the person who's benefiting. Impure paternalism involves cases where the people being restricted, some of those benefit and some of those are not benefiting. So if you think of plain packaging, here, the smoker or would-be smokers might benefit because maybe they'll decide to smoke less because of the plain packaging, or maybe they just won't ever smoke at all because of the plain packaging. So they're being restricted in some way, but at the same time, they're benefiting. However, if you think of the tobacco company, well, they're also being restricted. They're not allowed to sell these packages that are really pretty and look like this anymore, and that's probably going to reduce their sales. And they're not benefiting for that, right? And in fact, Mr. Big Tobacco Company Big Shot here might not even smoke at all. He just sells cigarettes to people. So in this case, the people who are restricted is a broader group than those who benefit. And this is often going to be the case when you talk about impure paternalism. This is often going to arise when you're talking about consumer products, where the restriction impacts both the person selling it and the consumer. Okay, so let's look then at proportionality. 3 types: means ends, material, and relative. The means ends proportionality is essentially something we encountered earlier in the term when we looked at Childress and colleagues' public health ethics framework. And here the idea is that when you're implementing some action, like some public health intervention, you want to ask, does this intervention create risks? And are any of those risks of a similar magnitude as the harm that intervention is aiming to prevent? And so a common adage that's used to describe this is, don't use a cannon to kill a fly. This is sometimes attributed to Confucius, but cannons were invented like 1,000 years after Confucius lived. So probably Confucius never said this, but whatever, that's the idea. So we can discuss this in class. Can you think of a public health example to illustrate this idea? Material proportionality has to do, on the other hand, with warnings. And here the idea is that the warning should not suggest that something that's really unlikely to happen is in fact very common. And here the idea in the anchor reading is that sometimes the warnings on these plain packaging labels are suggesting that a really rare kind of cancer is something you definitely get if you smoked. And this raises some interesting questions about how likely should this adverse outcome be before it could be depicted on the label? And is the material proportionality about relative or absolute risks? So here, if in the case of oral cancer, you get this really big increase in relative risk from smoking, but the absolute risk is still fairly low. It's like less than 1%. So is it the absolute risk or is it the relative risk that's relevant when we're talking about material proportionality? Again, something we can discuss in class. Finally, that was material proportionality. Finally, relative proportionality has to do with comparing different cases. So the idea here is that, well, if you're going to put plain packaging for cigarettes, then you should put plain packaging on other things that are just as dangerous as cigarettes are. So the idea is that if the policy is acceptable for case X and Y is similar to X, then you should have that policy for Y too. And so the example that comes up in the anchor reading is to say, well, sure, cigarettes are bad, but, so is McDonald's food. So is, lots of foods like, French fries. And so does that mean we should have these warning labels on unhealthy foods too? Anchor kind of takes it as obvious that we shouldn't. And then he seems to think that's why we should think twice about having plain packaging for cigarettes as well. Again, this is something we can discuss in class about what makes two cases similar. And for example, is there something different between smoking and, say, unhealthy foods like French fries in this example?